It is great to be joined today by David Faris, who's an associate professor of political science at Roosevelt University, also the author of It's Time to Fight Dirty: How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics. David, it's so great to have you on. And this idea of fighting dirty is of particular interest right now because my audience has been very split recently in reaction to some of the tactics that have been adopted by anti-Trump activists, I guess we would call them. This includes ruining the meals at Mexican restaurants of different Trump administration officials and showing up outside of Kristen Nielsen's condo and playing audio of children crying at the border. And there's people in the audience who say to me, David, we need to take the high road because ultimately we are going to be sort of our own judges in the long run. And we need to feel good about the tactics that we're using. We don't want to stoop to their level. And the counter to that has been, listen, you're dealing with people who are ignoring all rules of decorum, tone, and they are not going to be defeated unless we do adopt some of these tactics. So let's start like at the broadest possible level. When we talk about fighting dirty, when you talk about it, what types of tactics are you referring to?
Sure. I mean, that's a great question. And thanks for having me on the show today. I think when we talk about fighting dirty, we're not talking about like cheating or lying. We're talking about sort of pressing the boundaries of procedural norms and sort of pressing the boundaries of legality and constitutionality, just as our opponents have been doing, I think, over the last 20 years. So it means things like using the full constitutional power of the minority in Congress to hold up legislation. It means not cooperating with the president at all. That is not giving Democratic votes to Republican priorities because sort of bipartisanship makes the party in power look good, and we don't want that. So I think that in terms of this whole debate about civility and whether it's okay to confront people in restaurants, I would tend more towards the confrontational side of that debate. I think the best way to enjoy a peaceful meal in D.C. is to not put children in cages. So I think that our activists are well within their rights to do things that are very confrontational. I mean, I think at the same time, you don't want to do things that are deeply alienating to people whose votes you need. So I think that there should always be a conversation about whether a certain tactic is really going to work or whether it's not. But if we believe our own rhetoric that we're in the midst of a crisis, in the midst of an emergency, I do think that means that we can do certain things and pursue certain tactics that we might not under other circumstances.
So let's pick a couple of the things you mentioned and talk sort of through the pragmatics of it, because I agree in principle with, for example, start holding up all the legislation you can, hold up a Supreme Court nomination if you can, so on and so forth. Very quickly, though, you get to, for example, because of the way that our House and Senate work, where Democrats are put in a position where because something that they want is bundled in to a bigger Republican bill or proposal, unless they go along with the Republican bill or proposal that includes an amendment that contains something that the Democrats want, they're simply not getting it. I hate that that's the way it is. I don't believe there's any rule that says that things have to be bundled together in this way. It is a deliberate political tactic that is done, but it happens. So what exactly do Democrats do in that case?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, I think that it's been very rare for Republicans to actually be smart about this, because what they have done is they've made the underlying legislation that they're pushing so repugnant that the things that they're offering as these poison pills just aren't enough to get Democrats to vote for things. I think the one time that they really succeeded in doing this well was with the Children's Health Insurance Program during the standoff over DACA in January and February. That worked really well, but since then we have seen Republicans in Congress sort of allowing the president to dictate this extremely regressive, unpopular agenda to them. And so even if they put goodies into a bill that diminishes legal immigration to the United States, it's not going to get Democratic votes because they just can't afford to attach themselves to legislation that toxic. I think occasionally something will come up that is a moral imperative for Democrats. And I think that we have seen them willing to do this, and I think that they should do this. And I'm thinking of something like funding the wall, this mythical wall, in exchange for the Dreamers. That's a compromise Democrats offered Republicans, and Republicans rejected it. So I think I'm only willing to compromise when I think there's something really morally imperative at stake. And that could be the Dreamers, that could be something about family separations, that could be something about the ACA. For 99% of everything else that's going to come before Congress, I'm in favor of obstruction.
I have made it pretty clear that I'm to the left of the Democratic Party, and I think that the Democratic Party is by and large to the right of the American people in general. But that being said, it is sort of the de facto path for progressivism right now because of the sort of structural impediments that exist to real third-party success. And that's not really what we're going to talk about today, but it sort of sets up my question to you, which is part of the problem that Democrats just aren't to the left enough on a lot of issues, such that the daylight between the Democrats and the Republicans isn't big enough to really take advantage from an activism point of view on so many of the structural issues, campaign finance, and many others that we could talk about. And I'm not someone, to be clear, David, that says there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans. I think the differences are significant and they are numerous. But on some structural issues, there isn't that much difference. And I wonder if that holds back the ability to sort of do the type of activism that you suggest.
Sure. I think that this is changing a lot. I think it's changed a lot over the last 2 years. I still see sort of pieces of that older Democratic Party that was not as distinguishable from Republicans as we might like. And I'm thinking about something like when 17 Democratic senators voted to roll back the Dodd-Frank bill earlier this year. That was a sort of a depressing reprise of the kind of Democratic politics that I think many of us have become frustrated with over the years. In terms of some other issues, though, I do think that there's more difference between Democrats than there was 10 years ago. I mean, if you think back to 2007, in the fight over immigration reform, there were still Democrats in the party who voted against comprehensive immigration reform. We have some problems with that legislation anyway. But the point is that 10 years ago, there were a significant number of Democrats in Congress who were unwilling to sign on to a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants or help for the Dreamers. So I think that's really changed over the last 10 years. To the point where I think support for the Dreamers is like a litmus test for being in the Democratic Party, in the same way that I think support for some form of Medicare for all or single-payer health insurance has become the default sort of center of gravity in the party. And that's really, really different than it was 10 years ago. I think that there are still some issues where there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that that is in the party's relationship to big business, to corporations, to drug companies. That's something that's going to take a little bit longer to shake out. But I do think I'm heartened that because I think the energy is on the side of these progressive activists who are doing the really hard work of running for elections, of holding people accountable. And I think in the long run, they may not win every primary, but I do think that that side of the party is winning a lot of policy fights that it was losing 10 or 20 years ago.
In part two of the interview, we'll talk about some of the specific areas you think that are good areas of focus for activism for Democrats. But to kind of set up that part of the conversation, we've talked about the way in which gerrymandering, in addition to just the sort of urban-rural divide, is a structural disadvantage for Democrats. And we spoke to Bill Oglesby, Professor Bill Oglesby, about that and sort of the dynamics of that. Can you talk about, other than that, what ways are sort of illustrative of how Democrats are at a structural disadvantage?
Sure. I think the most important structural disadvantage for Democrats is the U.S. Senate. The Senate, every state has the same 2 senators, according to the Constitution, whether you have 700,000 people like Wyoming or whether you have 38 million people like California. Over time, the way our politics have shaken out, this has given an enormous advantage to small rural states like North Dakota, like Vermont, Delaware, but they're mostly Republican, right? And because this is unamendable, like the Constitution says, in order to change equal representation in the Senate, you have to have the state's consent, and you're not going to get that. So this is a structural feature of our politics. It's unchangeable, and Democrats have probably a significant long-term deficit in the Senate because there's 30 or 31 Republican-leaning states and 20 or 21 Democratic-leaning states. So that, in a vacuum, Republicans will hold the Senate more often than they don't, just by virtue of the sort of the population dynamics of this country and the way that states were created and the sort of unique problem that we have in this country of we have all of these really tiny states with very small populations. So that is built into our politics in ways that I think Democrats have been really slow to recognize and to address.
How would you address something like that?
Well, we need more states. So because we can't do away with the Senate, we can't abolish the Senate, and we can't change the equal representation in the Senate. What we really need is to create more states that lean Democratic. And there's easier and harder ways to do this. The sort of the low-hanging fruit is statehood for Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, both of whom are significant entities that have no representation in Congress right now. D.C. has had a referendum that they overwhelmingly want to join the Union. Puerto Rico is a little bit more complicated story, but I do think that another referendum would show that the majority of Puerto Ricans would like to join the United States as a 52nd or 51st state, depending on what order you want to do it in. Both of those states would send 2 Democratic senators to D.C., and it would help sort of alleviate the imbalance that we see structurally in the Senate. And as we know in recent American history, if you don't control all 3 branches of government, you basically get nothing done. That's where our partisanship is. So we need to think about these creative solutions. We could also talk about the U.S. Virgin Islands or Guam or any number of territories the U.S. holds that could vote for statehood and could join the Union as a very small state.
Now, to the extent that Republicans hold the House and Senate, can they not simply prevent these territories from obtaining statehood, even if by referendum they say we want to do it?
Oh yeah, I mean, right now this is a non-starter.
Gotcha.
So Republicans recognize that D.C. would be a massive partisan loss for them, and they probably recognize that Puerto Rico would be too. And so they're obviously not going to act on this. I think that so part of the idea here is that there's sort of an elaborate fantasy where Democrats take power over the next 2 cycles, and we wake up in January 2021 in charge of the entire federal government. And the question is, like, what do we do with it? Because we need to address these structural barriers to progressive power, just as importantly as we focus on policy differences or Medicare for all these things. Those are important. The policy fights are important, and the policies are important. But it's also important if we're going to win in 2022 or 2024 to take down some of these structural barriers, and we have to do so creatively, like within the constitutional framework. And there's nothing stopping us from adding states.
In part 2 of the interview, we're actually going to talk about some of the other ideas that you have along those lines. We have been speaking with David Faris, who's an associate professor of political science at Roosevelt University. The book is called It's Time to Fight Dirty: How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics, and we'll pick up the conversation right there on tomorrow's program. We're continuing our conversation with David Faris, who's an associate professor of political science at Roosevelt University. We've been discussing the book, It's Time to Fight Dirty: How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics. So, David, we spoke about some of the structural disadvantages that affect Democrats in the United States. We talked about the idea of adding states. Washington, D.C. Was mentioned, as well as Puerto Rico, and we talked about some others. What else is on your list of tactics and approaches that Democrats can employ that would be under this general umbrella that you talk about in the book of fighting dirty?
Sure. I think that probably the most important thing that I write about in the book is voting rights. What we've seen over the last 20 years in the Republican Party is a concerted, sort of unified effort to pass laws that are legal, that are constitutional, been upheld by the Supreme Court, but that are explicitly designed to drive down Democratic turnout and to suppress Democratic votes. We're talking about things like these cookie cutter voter ID laws that have been passed in state after state, starting with the Bush administration. We're talking about things like felony disenfranchisement laws, the restrictions that many states have placed on early voting or eliminating days to vote early. All of these are tactics that Republicans are using. They're all legal, or at least they've been declared legal by the Supreme Court. I disagree. But they're using them because they know that it drives down Democratic turnout. And so in this case, fighting dirty just means sort of restoring the rights of these people who have had their franchise taken away from them. And the way that you can do that, we're fighting this battle on a state-by-state level right now. We're fighting for things like automatic voter registration, or we're challenging voter ID laws, or we're fighting things like the voter purges in Ohio. But what I write about is how all of these problems are amenable to a national piece of legislation passed by a Democratic Congress and signed by a Democratic president. And that piece of legislation, because of the Constitution's elections clause, could eliminate voter ID laws. It could re-enfranchise former or even current felons. It could declare a national voting holiday for federal elections. And it could demand that all states have automatic voter registration. And because federal and state elections in most times and places are run at the same time, the states would be forced to comply, probably for all of their elections. Right? The end result of all of this would be adding millions upon millions of Democratic-leaning voters to the voter rolls, be making it easier for them to vote. You would boost voter turnout on election day, and as we've seen again and again, when our people turn out, we win, and when they don't, we lose. And that's why Republicans are fighting so hard to prevent people from voting, because they fear the electorate. They fear the electorate because their policies are radioactive. And the only way that they can stay in power is to artificially drive down turnout. And so, you can call it fighting dirty, you can call it whatever you want, but it's really imperative that Democrats address this crisis in the voting system in this country.
My audience has been increasingly asking me about court packing, packing the court, and looking at an increase to the number of Supreme Court justices. Of course, when the appointed additional justices would be left-leaning rather than right-leaning. Can you talk a little bit about the dynamics of that and how difficult it is to actually implement?
Sure. I think the reason that we're talking about court packing a little bit right now is because of what Republicans did in 2016.
Right.
Which was that they held a seat open that President Obama had nominated Merrick Garland to fill that seat, and they just refused to do it. And what they did was they took advantage of another sort of problem with our Constitution, is the Constitution does not always spell out the obligations of the different political actors. So it says advice and consent of the Senate, but it doesn't say whether the Senate has to do it. How do they do it? Are there hearings? None of the ways that we use to confirm nominees to the court are really spelled out in the Constitution at all. So Republicans were right when they said that we don't have to do this, right? And it's like, okay, well, there's a lot of other stuff that's not in the Constitution either. And most important thing that's not in there is the number of justices on the Supreme Court. And so I think probably many of your viewers are familiar with the sort of the failure of FDR's court packing plan in the 30s. So he had a hostile Supreme Court that was striking down important measures of the New Deal. And when he was reelected in 1936 and reinaugurated in 1937, he feared that the Supreme Court was going to strike down the Social Security Act, which is like the signature piece of the New Deal, right? And so he came up with this plan that would have added a justice to the Supreme Court for everyone who was over 70 and wouldn't retire. So it was like age-based. And that plan was defeated not because it was unconstitutional, but because his allies in Congress just wouldn't go along with it. And there's some evidence to suggest he could have gotten something through if he'd just been willing to compromise on adding fewer justices, because that would have added 6. And I think the way that history remembers this incident is that, FDR had this terrible idea. It was defeated. It hurt him. It cost him support over the rest of his second term. But the underlying reality is that, the willingness of both of our parties to abide by these norms about the Supreme Court appointments is dependent on both parties observing them, right, at all times. And so when Republicans broke that bargain in 2016, they opened up a Pandora's box of responses. And so I think the Democrats would be well within their rights to add 2 justices to the Supreme Court the next time they're in power. I do think that they should offer a truce to Republicans in the form of a constitutional amendment. And this is what I actually think they should be talking about right now, is the way that the process is unfair. Some presidents get 0 appointments in 4 years, right? Carter got 0. Now Donald Trump gets 2 in 2 years, it's just preposterous, right? And if we had an amendment that capped tenure on the court at 18 years, gave every president the right to appoint 2 justices for every 4-year term, we could take this ugliness right out of our politics. I think Republicans will say no to that, and I think that Democrats have every right to pack the courts in response.
Let's talk a little bit about the Electoral College. There has been, particularly after Donald Trump lost in the popular vote to Hillary Clinton by almost 3 million votes in 2016, a renewed sort of call for eliminating the Electoral College in favor of like a national popular vote. And I'm curious where you kind of come down on it from. Is it actually good strategy for the left? Because on the one hand, it appears as though it has screwed Democrats twice in the last 5 elections. But at the same time, what Trump said is true in the sense that if you know going in that it's a popular vote election and not an electoral college election, you do campaign differently. And I wonder if it's actually that clear that it would be good for Democrats to get rid of the Electoral College.
Sure. It's a good question. I think one thing to keep in mind is that we almost did have this situation in the opposite direction in 2004. So if John Kerry had won another 100,000 votes in Ohio, he would have won the Electoral College, but lost the popular vote.
Right.
So I think the idea that this automatically, like that the Electoral College is structurally biased against Democrats, I don't think it is, in the same way that that the gerrymandered House is, or that the U.S. Senate is. I think the problems with the Electoral College are more about democratic legitimacy. So, I think it's just very destructive to the sort of shared sense that power is being exercised over us legitimately for the popular vote loser to take office through this sort of antiquated mechanism of the Electoral College. Unfortunately, I think we're stuck with it because it would require probably a constitutional amendment to get rid of. I know that there's talk of this sort of national popular vote compact, the Interstate Compact, where a bunch of states would get together and say that they would give their electoral votes to the popular vote winner, no matter who won the Electoral College. I don't think anybody knows what the fate of that compact would be in the courts after that election, because it would be contested, obviously, by whoever is losing out.
Do you know? I mean, my curiosity about that is, would it have to be contested state by state? I mean, in the sense that some of the legal opinions I've read seem pretty adamant that states can decide for themselves, in other words, how they handle the awarding of their state's electoral votes. So do you know more about exactly what the challenge would be?
I mean, I think that the Interstate Compact people, I think they're on pretty firm constitutional ground, right? I mean, I think that I think that what would happen is that in a handful of states, let's say that this happens, and a Republican wins the Electoral College, who loses the popular vote, that this compact is enforced, and then we have our little constitutional crisis. I think that people, Republicans in a small handful of states would sue. Or they'd sue in the number of states that they need to get back to 270 in the Electoral College, and I think that would it would be expedited up to the Supreme Court, I'm sure, because of the sort of the timely nature, just the way that Bush v. Gore was, right? And I think that there have been some cases in the past where the Supreme Court has narrowed the right of states to dispense with electoral votes as they see fit, and I think that while a strict reading of the Constitution would suggest that the compact is on firm ground, I think it's less firm in terms of the precedent here, because I think American democracy does have an interest in general. Like, take the Electoral College out of this, but I think that American democracy in general has an interest in not having electors in the Electoral College just do whatever they want, and we've had a few faithless electors here and there in our elections, where in an election where the Electoral College was decided by 30 or 40 or 50, one person is like, I'm not voting for George Bush or whatever. That has happened, and we don't bother with it because it wasn't the deciding vote. But I do wonder what the Supreme Court would do here, because we've seen times in our history where the Supreme Court makes the wrong decision, or invents a precedent, or invents a rationale out of the Constitution to justify making the ruling that it wants to make. And if this were to happen with the current 5-4 Republican majority on the court, my fear is that we'd have the constitutional crisis, we'd have litigation, and ultimately the Supreme Court would say, like, no, the states can't do this. And the reality is, they don't really need to be on firm constitutional footing to do that. They can just do it. So I don't know. I wouldn't hazard a prediction about how this would shake out. And I think it would be productive in the sense that, we could really bring this issue to a boil the next time this happens. And I think it's important to do so. But I'm not super confident that the popular vote folks would win.
In the very limited time we have left, I wanted to get your brief thoughts as to whether any of the changes that you and I have been talking about are Pelosi and Schumer, as the leaders of the Democratic Party, the conduits through which this type of change could be achieved in a realistic sense.
Yeah, I'm skeptical about that.
Yeah.
I don't dislike Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. They're very accomplished people. I think they're working very hard. I also think that they're sort of yearning for the return of a norm-based political order. it's not coming back from the dead. And sort of they say things all the time that make me think that they still don't quite get the partisan environment that they're operating in. And so I would prefer to see them both replaced by 2021 with sort of younger, more activist-oriented leaders who are willing to sort of make these really difficult decisions to fight and to fight hard, and if necessary, to fight dirty, as long as it's legal, because the Republican Party is such a threat, I think, to the future of this country right now, that we need political leaders that recognize that. When I see them, they both just look like they're having a little bit too much fun right now. Like I don't. It does. The sense of crisis does not emanate from Chuck Schumer, and I really think we're in a crisis, and I'd like our leadership to reflect that.
The book is called "It's Time to Fight Dirty: How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics." We've been speaking with the book's author, David Faris, who's also an associate professor of political science at Roosevelt University. David, I really appreciate your time today.
It's been great chatting. Thanks for having me on the show, David.